Alright, now we're going to continue looking at the brain. So we've talked about the adult brain structures, the cerebrum, diencephalon, cerebellum, and brainstem. So let's continue on and look further. Let's talk about the organization of the central nervous system. Because when you look at the 4 adult brain regions and the spinal cord, you start to see a pattern of tissue. This pattern concerns white matter and gray matter. White matter is just an area of tissue that's largely consisting of myelinated nerve fibers, and they're bundled together into large tracts. So think bundles of axons, and they all have myelin on them, or predominantly they do. Then you have gray matter, which is composed mainly of neuron cell bodies, or soma, dendrites, and some associated glial cells, blood vessels, but no axons, no fiber tracts. The white matter with its myelin appears lighter, so white, in comparison to the darker gray matter. And the orientation of these two groups of tissue in the brain and spinal cord can let you know what type of tissue you're looking at, especially in histological studies. So for example, here we have a brain and spinal cord image. We have a cross-section of both, and in the image at the top, we can see outer gray matter and inner white matter for the brain. But the brain also has basal ganglia, so it has this inner deep gray matter. Whereas the spinal cord, it has inner or internal gray matter and external white matter. So we could see based on the orientation of these two tissues, or we could note based on the orientation of these two tissues, what type of organ of the nervous system we're looking at based on what we see. Now keep in mind there's various parts and kind of some simplifications being given here, but in general, the spinal cord has internal gray matter and outer white matter. In general, the brain has outer superficial gray matter and inner deep white matter. Let's continue on and talk about those canals or spaces that are in the brain. The brain actually floats in a bath of cerebrospinal fluid that surrounds it, but this fluid also fills internal large open structures called ventricles in the brain. Now these are fluid-filled spaces that help keep the brain buoyant and cushioned, but they're also lined by ependymal glial cells, and modified ependymal cells in these ventricles, which are called the choroid plexus, actually produce cerebrospinal fluid. The ventricles of the brain are continuous with the spinal cord and its middle space called the central canal, and all of these connected areas are filled with CSF. You actually have 4 ventricles in the brain. The first 2 are paired C-shaped lateral ventricles that extend laterally into the cerebral hemispheres. The 3rd ventricle is found in the diencephalon, and the 4th ventricle is found in the hindbrain or dorsal to the pons. You could also find it at the base of the cerebellum and near the spinal cord. But if we were to take a closer look at the brain, besides just its orientation of tissue and the location of ventricles, we could look at things like the parts of the cerebral hemispheres, because you actually have 3 basic regions for the cerebrum. Now it makes up about 83% of the brain. It's that large structure that has those convolutions and went through civilization. The 3 parts are the cerebral cortex, which is superficial gray matter, deep white matter, and very deep gray matter. So gray matter we find embedded in that white matter. Again, this is the part that contains ridges and grooves and valleys. The ridges are called gyri, or singular gyrus, and the grooves and valleys are called sulci, or singular sulcus. The 2 hemispheres are also separated by a longitudinal fissure, so again that separates the left and right hemispheres, and these hemispheres are actually only connected by a small piece of transverse white matter called the corpus callosum. There's also a transverse cerebral fissure, which is a space or kind of indentation that separates the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Here you can see the transverse cerebral fissure, and here you can see the longitudinal fissure. Next, we're going to be looking at the lobes of the brain. And these lobes also come with specific gyri and sulci. Now the lobes are frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and insular. The insular lobe sits deep, mainly to the temporal lobe, but also a little under the frontal and parietal lobe's lateral sides. We also have the frontal lobe towards the front, occipital lobe towards the back, and the parietal lobe in between. Now there's notable sulci and gyri, like the central sulcus, which is a deep groove that separates the frontal and parietal lobes. There's also the parieto-occipital sulcus on the medial surface of the posterior hemisphere of the brain that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. If we go back to the central sulcus, there's a gyrus in front of the central sulcus, so a ridge in front of a valley called the precentral gyrus. And then if we go back to the central sulcus, there is a gyrus behind the central sulcus, so a ridge behind that deep valley called the postcentral gyrus. There's also a lateral sulcus that separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobe. So these are all locations where we'll find different cortices or areas of the brain that we're going to talk about further. All right, next let's take a closer look at those lobes of the brain. And we also have a better view of the insular lobe. They've actually pulled down the temporal lobe in this image, so you can see those gyri of the insula. All right, let's continue on and talk about the cerebral cortex. Let's talk about parts of the cerebrum. So the cerebral cortex is that superficial gray matter of the brain. It accounts for 40% of the mass of the brain, and it enables things like sensation, communication, memory, understanding, voluntary movements, and so it's considered really the location of the conscious mind. And each hemisphere of the cerebrum is going to act contralaterally or control the opposite side of the body. So even though the hemispheres are not equal in function, they are connected, so no functional area acts alone, and conscious behavior always involves the entire cortex. So again, when we say cortex, or cerebral cortex, we're just talking about the outer gray matter of the cerebrum, not the deep inner matter, not the basal nuclei. And the overlapping functional areas of the cerebral cortex match the functional capabilities of the nervous system. It has motor areas that control voluntary movement, sensory areas that are going to give us conscious awareness of sensation, and association areas that integrate, that take diverse information and put it all together. So let's look at the motor areas first. You have the primary somatic motor cortex. So primary, kind of first and foremost, also known as somatic, so soma, something to do with the body, motor cortex, so primary or somatic motor cortex. So it should make sense from its name that it's involved in something to do with skeletal muscle, because it's going to be a motor cortex having something to do with the body, and skeletal muscles move the body. Well, if that's kind of what you get from the name, or now that makes sense to you, then you would be correct. It is involved in conscious control of precise or skilled voluntary movements of our skeletal muscles. So it's involved in sending out outputs to our skeletal muscles on how to move. Then we have the premotor cortex. This is actually going to be in a location very close to the primary motor cortex in the brain, and it is a region that selects and sequences basic motor movements into more complex tasks. So we might have kind of a basic motor output from the primary motor cortex that then travels to the premotor cortex to get sequenced into steps. That would be something that allows you to have multiple muscle contractions to do something like typing or playing a musical instrument. Other motor areas that we can find mainly in this frontal lobe is Broca's area, which is a special motor speech area that directs the muscles involved in speech production. It's usually present only in the left hemisphere. It can be present in the right. And there's also a frontal eye field, which controls voluntary movement or skeletal muscle of the eyes. So here in this image, you can see the location for those motor areas. Note that they are all located in that frontal lobe. So right in front of the central sulcus, in the precentral gyrus, is where you would find the primary motor cortex. In front of the primary motor cortex is where you would find the premotor cortex. You can also note the frontal eye field, which makes up part of that premotor cortex on the lateral left, and Broca's area, which is a little bit further down on the lateral side of the frontal lobe. Those are outlined by dashes. And when we're talking about motor areas and how they control outputs that go to the body and they regulate things like skeletal muscle, we actually kind of can take a map and represent spatially the entire body on that primary motor cortex. And so that creates a type of body mapping that's called somatotopy. And so it looks kind of like a caricature when you look at this map. And it's a caricature that can be laid over the motor cortex, and the areas displayed having the largest structures, so like a big hand or a small foot or something like that, we'll see in just a moment, that is actually going to dictate or let you know which areas have more precise motor control and those that don't. Those that are displayed as being bigger structures have the most precise motor control, and those that are displayed as being much smaller have less precise motor control. You can do a similar thing with the sensory areas. You can create a homunculus, which is a name for this caricature. So you can have them for both motor and sensory information. And that's what we see here. We see the motor homunculus on the left and the sensory homunculus on the right. For the motor homunculus on the left, the entire body is being represented spatially in the primary motor cortex of each hemisphere. Note that areas like the face and the hands are a little bit bigger than something like the toes or the knee, and that's because they are allowed more precise motor control. On the right in blue, we're seeing the sensory homunculus, where we're seeing the relative amount of or location of cortical tissue that's devoted to each sensory function, and is proportional to these distorted body diagrams. So again, we have a lot of sensation capability from our fingers, from our face, from our tongue, especially a lot more compared to things like our elbow or our knee. So we're going to continue on and talk more about each one of those motor areas we've already been introduced to. So that's going to be in the next video. So we'll start with the primary motor cortex next.